From the Institute for Research on Public Policy, this is Futureproofing Canada. I'm your host, Jennifer Ditchburn, the President and CEO of the IRPP. As the head of a think tank, I get to spend a lot of time talking to really smart people who are passionate about this country and who see a lot of opportunity, are actually optimistic, believe it or not. You wouldn't know that by listening to the news every day. But even though we're in challenging times, there's a lot of ideas for unlocking our potential and making us a more confident country. And so the idea behind this podcast is to let you into some of those types of conversations that we have on a daily and weekly basis at the Institute. Someone who has a lot of optimism and a unique vantage point on the country is Yukon Premier Ranj Pillai, our first guest. Pillai has been Premier since 2023, and prior to that worked in several senior cabinet roles, including as Deputy Premier, Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources, and as Minister of Economic Development. In other words, he knows a lot about the business environment in the territory. During his time in the top office, he's become a leading Canadian voice from the north, pushing us Southerners to pay closer attention to this often overlooked part of our country. I've had the pleasure of visiting Yukon twice, most recently last September. And if you're thinking about a Canadian destination this year, I couldn't recommend a nicer place to go. It's absolutely breathtaking. And if you're there in the summer, you get the bonus of many more hours of daylight. In our conversation, Premier Pillai and I talk about the opportunities that can be unlocked in Yukon that would reap benefits for all Canadians. And he also gives us a bit of a window into what it's like to be at the First Minister's table in the middle of a tariff war with the United States. Here's our conversation. Mr. Premier, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
I appreciate that you took time out of your busy schedule because I realize that all of our first ministers are going full tilt right now. So thank you very much for sparing the time.
No problem. Look, happy to be here and share some information in the story about the Yukon.
So as we're speaking, we're still in the middle of this Donald Trump telenovela that has like a cliffhanger basically every day, and we're wondering what drama the next day will hold. How are you and your colleagues navigating this time? I know that you're having pretty frequent First Ministers meetings with the other premiers and Prime Minister Carney. Give us a sense of what that's like in these last, I guess it's been months now, but especially in the last few weeks.
Well, first of all, I think at home in each province and territory, you're really focused on what you can control. So, you're making sure that as we go into the spring, everybody's tabling budgets. So what can you do with the information you have? How do you prepare? For me, of course, how do I prepare Yukon businesses? How do I, support them? How do I think about Yukon workers? What's my exposure to what's been put on the table from this administration, knowing that goalposts are consistently changing? And I mean, of course, as we spend time together, we've seen dramatic changes in the markets even in the last 48 hours. So this is, unprecedented times, of course. At the table, it's been, I think something pretty special to experience. I would say people have really come together at the First Minister's table. I think people have worked to ensure that they're supporting each other, getting to know each other really well. There's always been good camaraderie at the table. We have Northern premiers. I'm in the middle of chairing that right now. So with both other territorial premiers, we try to work on shared priorities. A lot of the work that we have been putting forward to Canada and to Canadians has now become into sharp focus. When we talk about Arctic security, we talk about the North. It's almost something we've been waiting to have a broader, bigger conversation. So that gives us a chance to talk to our colleagues about those important things. We also have a Western Premiers table, which I was lucky enough last year to chair. So we had done a lot of work around infrastructure, what's required to build the nation, what's required for nation building projects. So a lot of that work had been completed, and now we're in a position, as we hear all of the individuals running for Prime Minister, and in response to the tariffs, the fact that we need to do those things inside our own country. So those tables really have, set us up well for conversations. And then at the bigger table, the Council of Federation, I think we're in a good position because Premier Ford's done a great job. Like, it's not easy having all the premiers at the table. A lot of strong personalities. Everybody, of course, rightly so, has their own agendas representing their uh, provinces and territories. But the last call, I have to say, understanding that the auto tariffs were coming into place, everybody was very strong. And I mean, I'll specifically talk to the fact that Danielle Smith, as premier, was there voicing her support towards Premier Ford and what did he need and how could she help. And so that might not always play out publicly in the media,
Right.
but behind everybody's trying to help each other in any way they can.
Well, because you can get the impression that there's a, a burgeoning unity crisis in Canada, or that our federal system is just not the best system for approaching a major geopolitical crisis, a major kind of national economic crisis is the one that they're living through. But it sounds to me like you're seeing something different from the inside.
Yeah, it's moving in the right way. What I would share with you is many things that have been put in front of us, either as regions or as a country. I think in the back of our minds, we always have had that comfort. Oh, we're going to succeed through this. Even going through 2020 and 2021. I mean, scary times, lots of upheaval. But as you move through that experience, you were thinking, as leaders, I believe people are like, we're going to get over this. Like, we're responding in a good way. We're making sure we deploy the right resources. But this is much higher stakes, and what we're being called upon as Canadians and as leaders, in my perspective, is it's a much bigger, much more significant request. This is about putting differences aside in our ideology as Canadians. Like, this is, to maybe I'm making it too simplistic, but it's like the left view of what we should do on positioning ourselves around climate change, on development, and then the sort of a more pro-development view of saying, like, we really have to build. We really have to build to get ourselves in a position here to to have the right base for our economy. And at the same time, we have to, unlearn how we have had these relationships with the US, and we have to think in a much different, east-west way than north-south. And we know in the north that's been hard to try to get Canadians to think about. So it's also, we will. Nobody has said yet that this is a foregone conclusion that we will succeed. There's a lot to do, and people are going to have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable for a period of time to make this work.
Right. I want to get to economic development, Arctic security, but maybe first tell me about how people in the Yukon are impacted by tariffs, or the specter of tariffs, because in some ways things are unfolding right now. But how are they feeling this?
It'll be on cost. I mean, when you look at our economy, we don't have the exposure because we don't have the manufacturing base that other regions have. But when you know that it's really expensive to build, and the building that we need to do is incredibly important when we think about things like sovereignty. That's the hard infrastructure. That's the roads, the bridges, all of the work, upgrading our airports, things that we've been doing over the last 8 going into 9 years as a government. But now you're in a position to understand, do you have enough money to do it? To speak bluntly, do you have enough money budgeted to do those projects? And how do you make sure that you identify the materials in this country to stay in line with the budgets you've had and to execute those projects? How does the person that's going to the grocery store, that's already felt, the inflationary pressures over the last number of years, when they go to buy groceries, when they go to buy the things they need for their life, how will that affect them? And then, the cloud coming over the entire country to say, are we going to be driven into a bigger recession potentially? Are we going to be able to succeed through this? And if we do have those larger economic pressures. What does that mean to, the value of a home? What does that mean for the cost of borrowing? All those things that, we've kind of taken for granted. There's been pressure, but like, what does this mean? So I think those are the things that just they bring an anxiety to the average person, and well, to leaders, to everybody, to try to understand what this could mean. But again, we're not going to see. We've got two or three manufacturers that we're ready to step in and help them. We want to see them identify new markets so they can continue to thrive. But for us, it's going to be sort of that broader impact, that the same that most Canadians will feel. We just may feel it a little bit more here when it comes to cost of living.
And are there some ways in the short term that you can help with that immediate cost of living issue? Some policy tools that you have at your disposal?
Yeah, we're watching right now to get a real understanding of what the federal government will do in their programs, just so we're not duplicating. I want to be congruent with what they do. So we started right away of looking at developing our policies. We had a really strong response in COVID. I don't think anybody wants to spend too much time talking about those years, but we from a public policy perspective, we did some incredible things. We were building programs in 5 days, and we were bringing them through cabinet, treasury, getting them funded. We had public servants committed to coming up with solutions, and they were working incredibly long hours. And we put tiger teams or special task teams together. And I think, over that first month, we produced 9 different programs. And, a year later, big jurisdictions were coming to us. Some of the biggest provinces in the country were coming to us saying, okay, how did you build that program? How did it work? How did you do the costing on it? And we were sharing that. So as a small, nimble, uh, territorial government, we learned a lot. So it was, when we started down the path where we are now, it was bringing some of the same leaders together and saying, okay, we got it. This is the tempo we have to respond at. It, because the goalposts have changed, it hasn't quite been at that level or that speed that we've had to respond. But we've got programs right now that we're looking at for our businesses. So we're looking at two things: supporting the businesses that are affected by deploying grant money towards them, but also looking at places in our economy where we can diversify or see new things happen that will have less exposure to tariffs, but can still thrive, either by new markets or by making sure that their markets are within the country. Another thing we've done, which set us up well, a number of things that actually, to be open, that set us up well. We eliminated the small business tax when we came into government. There's no small business tax. Like we thought it was incredibly important for the smaller businesses in the north to not have to deal with that burden. And so that has, I think, set the stage well for a lot of our small businesses. We've also rolled out the first of its kind, which was a sick leave program, for the private sector. So we were funding the private sector to make sure they could retain their staff, making sure that they could build the proper supports, because a lot of the hospitality businesses, retail, just don't have that. But then people, something happens to them, they get sick. So just, again, helping and supporting. But I would say our First Nation procurement policy is something that every province and territory should look at. And that was our ability to have carve-outs, which we could do based on the treaty relationship with First Nations. But it's not just First Nation companies, it's joint ventures between Canadian companies, Yukon companies, with First Nation development corporations. And so it gave them, us legal avenues for people to compete inside a procurement process that then left dollars not just in the territory but in the country. And having that framework in place right now, when we're talking about ensuring that we have Canadian companies getting the larger contracts, and having a tool that's not going to be challenged, because it's a legal obligation that we have, based on these treaties in the Yukon specifically that are anchored in the Constitution of the country. So I think we're just moving more towards that. It's about keeping those dollars here and using the work that we did over the last 3 years to make sure, 4 years, to make sure we can do that. When it comes to workers, we're going to have to see. We're lucky. I mean, we have the highest percentage. I looked at the numbers yesterday. We have the highest percentage of employed people out of our workforce in the country. It's like 73% of our folks are in our population working. We've had the lowest unemployment rate for, we're going into 9 years. We kind of bounce between number one and number two or number three, but I think last month we went down again when the country went up, and we were in a position to hold, I think, the second spot by, a couple of tenths. So look, I think when we're going in, we have a strong economy, which you want to have going into a situation like this, and we've been lucky to have that. So, the foundation's there, but we'll see what happens as bigger decisions are made across the border.
Yeah, it does sound like you built a certain kind of muscle or nimbleness during the pandemic that could be brought out. And in the same way as the pandemic kind of focused the mind, I guess, nationally, I see that happening again. And a lot of the conversations that I'm sure you've been having the same kinds are that Donald Trump handed us an opportunity to kind of move us out of a certain policy inertia and finally get big things done because we have to, as a term in terms of sort of existential threat. But I want to read something that you wrote in the Globe and Mail. You said, quote, "The painful, long-standing problem in Canada is that Southern Canadians do not care much about the far north or Arctic defense." And suddenly those two things are really, front and center in terms of the national conversation. So in terms of economic development in the north, so a lot of talk about critical minerals, exploration, resource development in the territories in northern Ontario, northern Saskatchewan, and so on. What do you see as the top opportunities in your territory in terms of possible development that we could be seizing on?
There's so much. I mean, and for me, that's an exciting policy conversation. So I'll try to be quick and not delve too deep. The first would be when I'm speaking on Bay Street or I'm speaking, in different centers in Canada. One of the things I always try to share with people is let's do a parallel. When you think about a big tech company coming to Toronto, and a number of years ago there was the competition to see where the Google campus was going to be, and in downtown Toronto it was like this if we get this if we win this competition, this will be a $5 billion capital expenditure in our downtown core, I think was the number. Sorry if I'm off by a bit. And this was really going to change. All these jobs are going to be created, and what this economic impact to the region. Well, for us, 5 projects here in the critical mineral space have a capital expenditure of $6 to $7 billion. The big projects, but we have a population of 46,000 people, which lends to some challenges.
Mm-hmm.
But it just to try to understand the magnitude of what's available here, just in the critical mineral space. I mean, we have arguably the strongest tourism when you look at contribution to GDP of any province or territory. Where we're going on knowledge-based economy, where we see our Indigenous companies moving, where you see the potential on Arctic security spend, all of that's there too. But just in the critical mineral space, there's so much. So I think you'll see announcements. I don't want to get ahead of myself, that just are timely because of where we are. We probably have 1 to 2 projects that will be going. There'll be more public conversation about them over the next 60 to 90 days. And in both of those cases, what you will see is private sector mineral projects that will have equity ownership by Indigenous governments. And so you've seen royalty streams that are being announced, but this will be, mining projects owned by the private sector, and some of them by very well-known Canadian entrepreneurs, like
Mm-hmm.
folks that have spent time in Mining Hall of Fame and others, but have now pivoted back to say, hey, we're going to actually team up with a First Nation on their traditional territory to bring a project. And what we're going to be taking under the ground is incredibly important. So I think that that's something that's really special, which sets us up well. So we're talking more along the lines of copper. We're talking zinc. These are the things when you're in Washington. Over the last, or my last visit, zinc was this constant conversation with policymakers on the Hill. Do you have zinc? What can you do? And of course, tungsten's another one, which is really big. So we had some investment under the previous Biden administration made a decision to team up with Canada to put some money into feasibility work around a tungsten project as well. So there's a lot there. I think that we have an opportunity to see. But I think for the average Canadian, going back to the start of that question, they have to see something in there for them. I just think it's so obscure for them to think, well, the Canada's the North. We like to think about that image as Canadians, about that connection. But I think what people that are sitting in a coffee shop in Montreal, or they're sitting in Toronto or Vancouver, have to understand is everything that's getting built in Northern Canada, all those, that supply chain is coming from our major cities. Like everything that's coming to the Yukon, for the most part, if it's being driven, is these are all things coming through Alberta. There's a huge impact for Alberta and British Columbia on anything that gets built here. And so if you really want to diversify your economy, if you want to keep the Canadian economy strong, and you want to see it grow, the expenditures in the North will have, they'll have significant impact on the economy of the entire country. And I think as Canadians, you also, as you're threatened by your around sovereignty, I think you dig in and you understand that those regions, which we've all said as Northern leaders for a long time, are the areas where we have the most exposure and very porous borders. Incredibly important now to think about new technologies to secure and monitor, and I guess as Canadians, the other thing I would share with any of the people listening to this is, what, as Canada has not had that sharp focus on the North, everybody else has. As I said, I'm in the calling today, connecting with you from the main government building. I've had a steady stream of diplomats from around the world for the last 7 years walking in to meet with me. Um, you know, Predominantly friendly nations that just want to partner with us, and they want to be part of our economy. They want to talk about the Arctic, but I probably have spent more time speaking with diplomats from around the world about the Arctic and how important it is than I have with, you know, policymakers in southern Canada.
So there's great opportunities on critical minerals, some of them which are essential to electrification, uh,
Yeah.
and so on, and other processes. What kind of infrastructure are we talking about? The investment that we need to make those projects get off the ground in a meaningful way.
Sure. Well, I think we've done a lot of work already, so I think it's good to share with folks that are listening. We've got about almost 8,000 kilometers of all season roads uh, that are maintained and supported, and we've done that. We've continued to do that work. Our international airport is getting a $250 million lift, so uh, new runway extensions really important. And we have 20 plus other strips and aerodromes throughout the Yukon. Uh, we built a fiber line that is almost 800 kilometers long, really complex project. 1,100 water crossings. We had to directionally drill under the uh, Mackenzie Delta, but that has given redundancy to the connectivity of the North. Like those are things we didn't have, but some of our other circumpolar colleagues did have. So when you think about communication, when you think about road infrastructure, flying, all of those things are incredibly important. For us on the horizon is an upgrade to a port which is in the U.S. So we're in a precarious position right now
Mhm.
because we're trying to build out this port. We've been working with a small community that's about an hour and about 2 hours south of Whitehorse, where we've always had access to tidewater. So we're still working on that, even while we're going through this challenging time. We think that's really important, and really energy. Uh, there might have been a posture change, I think, by a lot of folks around ESG and where things are going, sort of what their view of that is. But look, for us, at the end of the day, we still need power and access to power to make sure that projects run. And we've started down the road now of doing an intensive feasibility around building a hydro line to between the Yukon and British Columbia. And so we've been talking with BC about that for a number of years. We think it's a way for us to purchase power, uh, and we can pivot to do that quickly when we need it. And at the same time, over time, when we think about things like SMRs, we're in a position, and I think with a lot of interest from First Nation governments and development corporations, to be able to stand up infrastructure like that and sell back into British Columbia, where it's not something that they're looking at at this time. So those are, it's usually people, ports, power. When you're talking to resource companies,
Mm,
those are the things they want to know,
right.
that you have in place. But I would just say that what we have to be able to do is build projects. So I don't think there's been any lack of money over the last multiple mandates of the federal government to put money on the table for projects. I but I think the honest conversation is it was difficult for them to get money out the door. Um, the model wasn't working, and I had times where really strong federal ministers that I have good relationships with came to me and said, "Look, we're ready to go. We'll sign an agreement with you to fund this project." But when you're building a project that's $2 billion, 46,000 people are not going to shoulder that level of debt maintenance. It just can't happen. And you need a federal government that wants the nation build and understand the same way the other big pieces of infrastructure across this country were built, that they have to step in. And over time, that's going to be incredibly important for our country, our sovereignty, our security. So, my colleagues in the other two territories will talk about it. It will be, it's going to be ports, it's going to be power, it's going to be telecommunications. Um, as we see automation move into the mining sector, you're going to have redundant telecommunications and fiber. And so those are all the things that, as a country, I think we really need to think about building out, because the blueprint's there.
Right.
You just have to look at you just have to look to what's going on in northern parts of Russia, what's going on in Nordic countries, and how are they building it? Because they all are.
One of the things that's raised a lot around why projects can't get done is a long approvals process. And I've taken note that in the current discourse, there's suddenly Indigenous participation seems to have fallen off the table. And when we hear politicians talk, I mean, we're in the middle of an election campaign, um, but Yukon is a leader in shared governance with First Nations. You just mentioned projects that are going to come on board where there's Indigenous partnership. What is your take on the current conversation that we're having around major projects and Indigenous participation and partnership on them? Because we're at a state now where we're no longer talking just about consultation around projects on Indigenous land, but consent, which is a whole other ballpark. But seems like we're not talking about that anymore.
I'll share a couple things with you. What's the landscape like here? It's tomorrow. I will be sitting after I'll have meetings this afternoon after we finish our discussion here, and I will be in a meeting tomorrow with an invitation that's been sent out to all First Nation chiefs in the Yukon, and we'll be coming together. I'll be at that table with my mines minister, and we will be identifying the framework that will be used on a modern mining legislation, which is something that was committed to when treaties were signed in the Yukon. So the policy architecture is being co-developed by First Nation leaders, and so there's that give and take on how do you put this in place. Doesn't matter when you're in a government, you're used to doing things the way you do it, and how you the powers you have to sign off and your prerogative and perspective, but inevitably you have to find common ground to be able to get that good policy work done. And the values that First Nation governments are bringing to the table around ensuring that traditional ways of living and the environment is secure, but also that they have an opportunity to be part of that, is an exceptional approach, I think. When I listen to the individuals running for prime minister, yeah, they simplify things. I hear a lot of people simplify it, or they don't have a complete grasp of Canadian case law. I guess I don't. I've spent almost a decade in this environment, and right down to the minutia of how you walk through every element of environmental assessment. So these pre screenings that have been talked about, where you don't even know what you're going to build on a particular site, but yet you've permitted it. That doesn't. I don't know how you do that. Maybe I don't know. I just have all the details. I think what we've heard from one person is that the federal government will get out of the way and let the provinces lead that, and I think that that's a good approach. We've got a tripartite system, which is we have First Nations at the table with the territorial government and the federal government as we do our work. And so everybody's a voice there, but I think that the federal government can lean on the work that we do during an assessment and give us a bit more of an opportunity, not because we're going to have a better sense of where things are than they are. It's just we don't want duplication in the process, and I think that's incredibly important. I think with First Nation governments starting to be equity owners, they will have a stronger understanding of each project, and they will have a firewall in place where their environmental teams can still do interventions and review and assessment, but but they'll have a stronger understanding of the project as a whole, and they'll get to define how the project gets built. Like, what's the infrastructure? What's the methodology that's used on extraction? How are you processing projects? So I think when we talk mining, that's where we have to be. But there's no way. I will just say to you that the First Nations role in assessment is not still going to be as important as it was yesterday.
Right.
That doesn't, it doesn't. People want to during a campaign try to simplify it, but it's going to be about respectful dialogue and understanding the position of others. But sticking to timelines is really important. I think that's very simple one. If it's a 90-day response, stick to the 90-day response. If it's a one window approach, absolutely. Those are all things that can help us. And I'll just say that as much as we get a hard time in our country, in our regions, about the processes, and people always point to somewhere else is not always better. It's either unstable, there's geopolitical threats, and in some cases, it's an urban myth that things are moving so quick everywhere else. And that's from being at the table for a long time. I think we just sort of give ourselves a hard time sometimes.
On Arctic defense, you've pointed out there have been many promises made over the years, but then when it comes to implementation time, it can be a kind of half-hearted response to some of the infrastructure needs. And now we're in a situation where the United States isn't necessarily a reliable ally for us. And you've also pointed out that Northerners have seen this movie before, maybe more acutely in terms of American movements in the North and threats to our sovereignty. How do you think we should be thinking about the investments that we make in defense and security in the North in terms of prioritizing different projects?
Well, we have to stop thinking around a 3 to 4 year cycle on the projects. I mean, that's a bigger challenge, I think, with our whole governance structure and how people think about it. We have to understand that there needs to be a long-term plan that we get behind, because the time, energy, and money that it takes to build projects in the North are so significant. If you're going to build a port, let's just say, going through the early design, making sure you go through the environmental assessment, which is incredibly important because you're going into very fragile ecosystems, but yet it's important to have that infrastructure in place, making sure you cost it out, and then building something like that when folks come back and say, well, in 25, it's not till 25 years time till we really see the Arctic as an active shipping routes. Well, if we start now, we're already behind on trying to build something based on how long it's taken us in the past to build things when they were required in our maritime environment in the North. So I think we have to be in a position to understand it's going to be great for our economy. That's just something I think that people can understand and agree with. It's going to be really important for Northerners to make sure that they have a role to play in it, because the benefits that come from build out like this, again, increases our opportunities for Northerners, quality of life, and that's really sovereignty. If you're really, when you talk to Northerners, what you'll hear is good, healthy, strong communities is really what sovereignty is. It's not just going to be an installation somewhere. It's not just going to be an F-35 base. It's more than that. So we have to do two things at the same time. Got to make sure that we're building strong communities. We're investing in healthcare, housing, infrastructure at the same time as building those projects out. But we have to pick a line and start to be ambitious as well. I think my colleagues in the other two territories are well poised for really significant projects that they want to get behind. I hear them when they're at the table with me, talking to federal leaders. So it's time to actually say, yes, we're going to commit to those. Yukon's well positioned in its own right because, I had some media here yesterday I was talking with, and a lot of people in Canada don't understand. Like, you can get in a car today where you are, Jennifer, and you can drive here. I mean, we are the one territory where you've got access from southern Canada right to the Arctic Ocean. We have a long history of military presence that's subsided over the last number of years. But when you go back to the history of this country, you think about the Northwest Mounted Police and people that were deployed here around gold rush time. Funny enough, they were actually deployed into Fort Selkirk in the Yukon because of threat of by the U.S. to our sovereignty.
Yes.
When you go back years and years ago,
Mhm.
so we're kind of in it. We're at that time right now where it's important to do that work. Um, the last piece I would say, what we've done, and I think you might be aware of this, we've just taken a leadership role as a province, as a territory. We've made sure that we have a strong voice when it comes to speaking with the federal government. And we did that through our Arctic Advisory, Security Advisory Group, our council that we brought together, really strong thinkers, academics, former members and leaders at the Canadian Armed Forces that are retired to be able to help us define our asks and help Canada understand what would work here. And now that's blossomed into the Canadian Institute for Arctic Security, our own think tank, which is now launched this year, which has really got a lot of support. And that's going to focus not just on Arctic security, but it's also going to focus on foreign interference because there's a lot of interest in the Arctic from many different individuals. And we want to make sure we track that as well and we understand that. So I think it's not just looking at Canada and saying, come here, you need to do this, but every region needs to step up and say, look, we know what we need. We understand it's your jurisdiction, but here's some ways that we can help you help your policy positions by working together.
Well, I'm biased, so but I think another think tank in a very sparse think tank environment in Canada is a good idea. So yeah, there's certainly a space for more work around defense and foreign policy. Just to close up, is there something that you think people don't think about enough, particularly in southern Canada, or that you would want to put on the agenda? Just one thing, as something that will really secure our future social, our standard of living, and our future prosperity. What would that one thing be?
That's a big question. I need to take the opportunity as a northerner and having the opportunity to speak with you to say that, look, I think that for us, looking and learning from what's happening in the north and being able to translate that to how we operate in other parts of Canada is really important. When it comes to what you're going to see in the Yukon with our relationship with First Nation governments, we can't just, that conversation doesn't just get moved to the side. It's about the fabric of our country. And through that respectful relationship, the sovereignty of the North will be a focus. Our ability to build out new economies that we haven't seen, the ability to build a stronger Canadian economy and foundation, because as we invest in many of those communities, that money's not going anywhere. That money's going to stay in this country because the folks that are in those communities have been in those communities for thousands of years. I think that as a grand bargain in the North is that relationship build, which then meets all of these different policy goals, is something that folks that are, whether they're sitting in Queen's Park, whether they're sitting in Victoria, whether they're sitting in a coffee shop, when they think about, can this be done? Yeah, it can be done because we've been doing it here. It's not always smooth. It's not always smooth. It is a series of courageous conversations
Mm.
that have to take place in order to do that. You're not always going to be in the same position, but you are always going to go back to the table respectfully and understand that it's such an important conversation. that it has to be had.
Premier Ranj Pillai, thank you so much for talking to us. Lots of food for thought there, and I appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for tuning in to Futureproofing Canada. Our executive producer is Cléa Desjardins. Our producer is Ricardo Montrose, and our production assistants are Elissa Coury and Blair Elliott. The show is mixed and engineered by Jackie Gallant, who also does our music. If you like what you heard and you'd like to find out more about our work at the IRPP, you can head over to irpp.org. You can subscribe to our newsletters and check out all our latest publications. And if you really, really like what you heard, leave us a review on your podcast app or share your feedback on social media. You can find us on most platforms at IRPP. For the Institute for Research on Public Policy, I'm Jennifer Ditchburn. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode of Futureproofing Canada.